Welcome to our latest edition of CharitEpulse. I'm joined, as always, with James Saunders from Moore Kingston Smith, who's the charity partner there. And in person, I've got Catherine Nostromji, who is a charity partner at Shakespeare Martineau. And my name is Charles Mosquito, and I'm a charities director at Quilter Cheviot. We've got a lot to discuss today, surprisingly, being the middle of the summer. The first thing that caught my eye was the Charity Commission has issued a report on trust and confidence in the Commission and in charities. James, you want to kick off?
Yeah, good news. I think that trust is up in charities at a high since somewhere around 2012, 2013, something like that. So obviously the public is having even more faith in charities than previously, which is nice to hear. The report did also say, I think, that actually donations, however, and contributions to charities are down. So although the trust is up, actually it's not quite coming through in monetary terms at the moment, which is something that the public might like to have a little look at. But all in all, I think it's certainly that from the trust point of view, seems good news.
And was it, James, that the donations were down, or was it the number of donations were lower? And I queried whether the amount of the donations actually was a higher amount, therefore it was a bit of a nonsensical story. And I wondered if I was just turning into a grumpy old woman, because I saw the results and thought, what a pointless waste of time exercise to ask these 4,500 people who seem to me to not know very much about charity at all, and then get them together. And some of them had focus groups, and I felt like they were sharing a tiny bit of knowledge but saying some quite ill-informed things. And so then I thought, then I'm not sure it really stacks up to much in terms of, is that a quality kind of review of what's the feeling of trust and confidence if it's from people who don't actually have much interaction with charities?
Yeah, I mean,
I suppose it's a high level point, isn't it? It's just, at that very top level, as a simple yardstick, if you like, it's a positive. I would like to think they compare like with like each year. So there's a control point. Yeah, you can start to quibble with the intricacies maybe, but overall, it's a nice story.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was quite interesting that, most of those claimed to have claimed to know the Commission well, had a broad grasp of its role, but then they go on to say that the intricacies of the Commission's role was less well understood, which, you think actually that's a pretty benign comment, isn't it? Because people have a fundamental understanding of what a regulator does, but doesn't necessarily need to understand the intricacies of what a regulator does. So I find that a bit bizarre. The other thing I think in the usual way of this is that they put the score of high trust of 7 to 10. Of course, charities come in at 6.5. I think we should remember that that's gone from 2018 from 5.5 to 6.5 today, which is a really good uptick. But then actually, when you go into the detail of other organisations, only doctors come higher at 7.1. So they only just creep into the high trust. So, I mean, how people make a finding on that. I thought the other thing that amused me was what people were, how could trust be improved both in the Commission and in charities? And it was around transparency of finances. Well, actually, I think most charities with their reporting is that is pretty transparent. And the other thing was capping salaries. So again, I find that quite frustrating in the respect that sort of instead of saying that people should be paid fairly, it's actually they're all being paid too much.
It's not proportionate, is it? I think it's just quite a blunt response, and I suppose that lack of transparency on finances would be, if you don't know where to look or we don't know how to understand the accounts, that's one thing. It's not to say it's not transparent enough. So,
well, I mean, you're moving into my specialist subject there, and obviously transparency does not equal understandability or ability to comprehend. I mean, the average charity accounts these days are extremely long, or the attempt is that they are extremely transparent and comparable. Now, whether they are understandable to the layman, well, I mean, that's a completely different question. And frankly, there are times when you think charity accounts are so convoluted that they lose impact. And we've spoken about this at length before about how do you get a standard charity down from 60 pages of accounts down to the nub of what people want to see.
Yeah, well, carry on banging that drum, isn't it? That we need a sort that is effectively designed for charities, not designed for everybody. The other thing I notice is that we now have a new minister for civil society, Stephanie Peacock. I don't know if either of you have come across her at all. Been MP for South Barnsley.
You look like I should know her.
Well,
I
just because she's from Yorkshire, yes, a good Yorkshire.
I did see, Charles. I did see. I think she was a trustee of a Yorkshire charity, Catherine. So in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, maybe she's come to a training session I've done. You just never know. I thought, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, I'm a bit worried about the how wide her brief is, because it's not just charities, is it, James?
No, we look at it. There's sport is a big one that goes in there as well, isn't it? With their and a couple of others. I think the one I looked at, media is the extra one as far as I can see. That was Stuart Andrew, the previous Undersecretary responsible for this sort of area. There was a separate role, Undersecretary role for media, which seems to have moved into Stephanie Peacock's portfolio. So there's quite a big one there, I think, that's added. And I think, Charles, you've spotted there were a few more that might be, there are a lot in there. There are a lot of different, individual lists in there, aren't there, that areas to cover.
I think what will be interesting, isn't it, is that they had a summit with the sector, before the election. What was it, in January, February time?
Yeah.
And there was definitely a commitment from the shadow front bench at the time to be working much more in partnership with the sector, not about more money, but just working more. So it'll be interesting to see whether this becomes more of a priority, or whether sport and media take up more time. Because those are two quite complex areas with some quite complex issues.
It's sport, media, civil society, and youth, I think, are the four areas that are.
And ceremonial and gambling for the.
Yeah, but the civil society and youth, you can see, go together in a way, but equally they're both quite chunky areas in their own right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So well, time will tell, no doubt, as we go through. The other thing I thought was really interesting is that the new Chief Executive, David Holdsworth, from the Charity Commission, his first public missive is a letter to the local authorities around complying with legal responsibilities as charitable trusteeships.
Interesting. Catherine, I thought, new Chief Exec, his first, as you say, first published letter, and this is the topic. And I thought, well, that demonstrates there must be a significant volume of these sorts of issues coming across the Charity Commission's desk. I work with local authorities frequently, but they are the ones, I imagine, that he is not writing to, because they are trying to comply with charity law. They are trying to make sure that they are, I suppose, respecting their different duties as local authority on one hand, charity trustee on another, but it's clearly not the case across the country. And I did wonder about that volume of land that must be under ownership or control, I suppose, of local authorities, albeit it is owned by charitable trusts. So I thought I was intrigued what was behind it, and whether there'll be more to follow, perhaps, or inquiries maybe.
Yeah, I've seen in a dim and distant past, it was a few years ago now, I've seen a local authority set up a charity to run a development zone. And it was very much seen as an arm of the local authority, not an independent charity. And of course, as the auditors at the time, we were constantly going back and saying, actually, the trustees need to make these decisions. The trustees need to talk about going concern. The trustees need to have meetings. Almost that basic, really. You've got to show that you are in charge of this thing independently, and you've got your charity hat on. Even if you are local authority representatives or representatives of another body, you've got to take that hat off, put your trustee hat on. And if they're companies as well, obviously a charity director, a company director rather. So you've got to be aware of what these hats are, what the responsibilities are under corporate law, under charity law, and you've got to make sure. Our focus obviously at the time as an accountant and auditor was about finances. You've got to be assessing going concern, that sort of thing. you've got to be responsible for the decision making in there, and you can't just say, well, the other body wants to do this, therefore we're doing it. There's got to be that separation of responsibility and power and authority.
I think the language was quite strong in the letter as well, in the respect he talks about urgent action required. And also, I don't know whether there's a difference between putting a public letter out there and writing privately. I don't know whether commissioner is allowed to do it, but that thing. But he did mention in the letter that in the last 3 years, that the regulator's case work team have dealt with 38 separate cases involving local authorities and charitable land. So it's obviously charitable land has been the big issue, where I think they have just done with the land whatever they want without actually realizing, one, that it was charitable. And I certainly know from my own personal experience where charities have had co-opted trustees from councillors. Their attendance record, certainly from my experience, has been pretty poor, and their understanding about their responsibilities and the conflicts have been quite, because they think they're coming in to represent the local authority, not actually. They are a trustee sitting on a charity where they are meant to be acting in the charity's best interest. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, very.
There's also the point, isn't there, about independent trustees. You know, if you're a board made up of total representatives from another body, well, there's the control issue, and you're in a corporate group. If you're going to have an independent trustee with an independent board, you know, it's a very good idea to have independent trustees on there as well.
Yeah, no, I think they do have independent trustees, a lot of them, but I'm not sure whether there was a whole lot of Victorian charities that ended up being swept into local authorities, and what reason that might have been for that to happen.
And often, I suppose, those leisure recreation grounds end up being mopped up, I think, from time to time, where the local authority becomes the sole trustee of it, but maybe never quite squared off what is it we're actually a trustee of. Village
halls and things like that, isn't it? So the other thing I noticed was Oscar had come out, expressed concerns around dominant behaviour in charities, both from individuals and from small groups, both trustees and employees. I thought that was quite an interesting, and they talk about founders believing they know best, forthright people with strong opinions. I'm afraid I fall into that camp. Trustees are content to let others do the heavy lifting, and long-serving trustees or employees with institutional memories. I don't know what you guys think on that.
There's a lot of different points there. The founder syndrome, I mean, we've done a podcast about it before, and the importance of letting go in terms of responsibility and longevity. The dominant personalities, I don't, you're going to have dominant personalities at times. The question is how you manage them. And having firstly, a chair who can manage them. Secondly, a process and a system that can deal with them and can be relied upon to iron out issues. And thirdly, when all said and done, you do want people who are collegiate and collaborative, even if they are forthright. But it doesn't mean you necessarily have to be confrontational and argumentative all the time. Strong opinions is one thing, but you've got to understand you're all in the same. You're all working towards the same end, aren't you? I mean, that culture is the as we've always said, culture is the key thing here, isn't it? You can have disagreements, but if you can disagree amicably and come to a conclusion and not let it tarnish the future relationship, then there's nothing wrong with having dominant personalities arguing forcefully for what they think is right.
Definitely agree. And I thought the same about the language. I found it fascinating that years gone by, the Charity Commission would talk about over-dominant individuals, and they quite often say it's an over-dominant chief exec who then becomes a quasi-trustee, but it was the emphasis on over. And I thought the same, you can be forthright, you can have an opinion, it's not necessarily a negative, it's that whole interaction, isn't it? So I thought clearly the unwritten, I assume, is that it's over-dominant, but I think it's that whole management of personalities, and sometimes actually you can be far too passive. You can sit with a board of trustees and think, well, someone needs to say something. You at least need a spark to get that discussion going.
You don't want a group of wet lettuces, do you, Catherine? You want a couple of Charles mosquitoes in there somewhere.
You definitely do.
I must admit, as a chair of a charity, I actively encourage my co-trustees to be, I call it gobby but vocal. And you're absolutely right. If you continue focusing on what the purpose of the charity is and your beneficiaries, you generally will come up with an amicable agreement. And sometimes people just have to compromise and say, well, yeah, I might feel that, but actually I'm going to go with the will of it. So yes, I think that is very much so. And if people enter this with the right spirit, actually, it shouldn't be an issue. But I think it's interesting that there's obviously been a number of cases, I assume they've had in Scotland, of which they felt it's important just to express to people. My biggest thing and the biggest irritation to me is where you've got trustees who effectively disengage and are not and letting out others do it. I think that's a much bigger issue on that. So the final thing I spotted was that Andrew Perkins commenting on the governance code, which is obviously the review of that has finished. And although he was very complimentary about the governance code, he did feel that it was too managerial in tone and lacked sufficient guidance on strategic reviews. And he also criticised that the diversity and equality had such a big section in it where strategy didn't. What do you guys think on that? Catherine, why don't you kick off?
I thought it was a bit simplistic. I mean, I saw the headline and then read a little bit where he said he thought it was too dry. And I did think it's not meant to be a laugh a minute. I mean, it's not. And also it's too dry and there was no suggestion of, therefore, well, how do you improve it then? Other than saying there's too much on EDI, but actually that's one principle out of 7. So take it or leave it. You don't have to over-reg it if you don't need to. So, I mean, I was interested that there is a review, and I did wonder whether we need it, whether anybody wants it, whether it was just reminders coming around that there was the review open. And I wondered if that was an indication that not many people are commenting on it. Which would perhaps suggest just leave it alone so we can use it. We don't need it tinkering with. So I wasn't necessarily thinking a governance code should emphasise strategy. I thought they're two different things.
I mean, if I remember correctly, the equality and diversity section was expanded enormously in the last update because it was almost not covered at all in the first one. So, I mean, okay, if it's a bit excessive in this most recent version, fine, but I think that's only a natural part of it. Was the new section last time round, so of course it's going to have an extra focus, and we can't get away from it. It was and still remains very, very topical since the original iteration and after the last update. So I mean, I think it was only right that got a lot of attention in the last revision. And I think I agree. I mean, the feedback generally seems to be on the governance code in general that it's been a good exercise. It's evolved well, and we don't want to break it too much with a major upheaval. It, as you say, Catherine, it's not meant to be a comedy roadshow, is it? It's supposed to be good governance and a key framework.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think the diversity and equality needed to have a reasonable amount of explanation about what they were trying to get everybody to think about and achieve, because it was quite a big quantum leap for a number of charities that were struggling with it. And these documents are difficult not to be dry. It's meant to set out a framework that trustees are meant to work, what do they call it, apply or explain. So not all of it. And you're also trying to cover a huge cross-section of different organizations with, different number of staff, different size and everything else. And one size fits all is really very difficult to incorporate, but I wouldn't advocate having a number of different ones. And also strategic review. Sorry, aren't there enough books on that? I mean, if people really need it, aren't there enough people you can get in as experts to come in and help you with that sort of?
We've got a toolkit.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. There we are. Well, perhaps we should give you a 30-second elevator pitch on the toolkit from Moore Kingston Smith. We haven't got one. Have you got one? No. There we go. Anyway, I think that probably covers everything we need to cover for today. Thank you to both Catherine and James for another excellent session. For those of you who are listening, you can get this on a podcast, YouTube, via all of our websites, Apple, is it Apple Podcasts?
Yeah.
And Spotify. And we would love for people to please comment, ask questions, anything along those lines. But anyway, thank you, James, and thank you, Catherine.